The Moon and the Sun by Vonda and McIntyre. This book came out in 1997 and it won the Nebula Award for Best Novel that year. It was up against another book that many people have probably heard of, George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones. This is book one in the Song of Ice and Fire series. I've read this book and I love it. The first three books in this series are some of the most fun entertainment that I've had while reading. And so I have had some high hopes for this book. It beat it out. What's interesting is there's some similarities between the two books that I noticed. The main character in this book, she's a young woman, very naive, very innocent. I saw some similarities between her and Sansa Stark from the Game of Thrones. There's in this book as well, one of the main characters is a dwarf who holds a high place in Louis XIV's court, which is mostly what this book is based around. I'll get into that in a minute. The dwarf in this book had a few similarities to Tyrion Lannister from Game of Thrones, not quite as diabolical. Now, what is this book about? So this is mostly a historical fiction fantasy book. It's a bit of a stretch to even classify this book as science fiction. If you use the term speculative fiction, that kind of encompasses everything. It might fit in there a little bit more. And Easton Press even acknowledged this. If you buy an Easton Press version of their books, they give you a collector's card in there. And I read the collector's card that came with this book, and right out of the gate, they mention how this is a bit of a stretch to call it science fiction, but it's a book about what if. It's an alternate history. What if something was different, and how would that impact? I'm going to do a little bit of a different thing in this video. At the end, I'll have to spoil something in this book. It'll spoil the main theme. It'll inadvertently spoil some of the plot, but it'll kind of let you know why this is kind of in the science fiction realm. I also think there's probably not a lot of my viewers so far that would be interested in reading this book. And so some people might want to see the spoiler at the end. If not, I'll have it time-stamped and just stop watching at that point. So the book takes place in the late 1600s, and it all revolves mostly around the king at the time of France, Louis XIV. He was one of the most powerful people in the world. I think one of the longest serving monarchs. I don't know much about this time period in the history, but it did make me go back and do a little research. And I think from what I understand, Vonda wrote a lot of the historical events as accurately as she could, but she also included some fictional characters that are inserted into this scenario. So the book starts out with the main character. Her name is Marie Joseph, or Joseph. I don't know exactly how to pronounce this. I'll probably butcher a lot of these French names. And her brother, his name is Yves. It's spelled Yves. He was commissioned by the king to go hunt this sea monster down. And the whole time in the beginning, they're talking about these sea monsters. Eventually, you start realizing they're talking about sea people, mermaids, mermen, things like that. And he is able to capture one, and he has another one that's dead and he's going to do a dissection on that one. So he brings them back to Versailles, and with grand flair, he shows up, and everyone's excited. The king's excited. He found these mythical creatures, and the king's really, his intention why he wanted these things is because there's this myth that there's if you eat part of their flesh, or something to do with eating part of these creatures, could grant you immortality. So he's one of the most powerful men in the world. He knows he's getting older, he's going to die, he's looking to become immortal. Now, there's all kinds of themes that are brought up. The Pope comes and gets introduced. There's issues between the king and the Pope of what the king is doing. Is this go against God, trying to become immortal in his flesh? There's one of the main characters, the dwarf. He is an atheist, so there's issues that revolve around that. There's so many issues. This is right around the time where Isaac Newton was alive, and he was coming up with all these mathematical theories. And so our main character, Marie, she is very interested in Newton, and she's wanting to go down that path in life. So ultimately, the whole plot revolves around what they're going to do with this sea creature. Now, our main character, Marie, she becomes kind of in charge of this creature, and she befriends this thing in a way. And so she wants to protect its life. And the king is kind of trying to decide, are these myths bogus? Like, am I going to become immortal if I eat it? There's a bunch of stuff going on around there, and I don't want to say too much else that will spoil anything. Now, the pros and cons for this book. The pros, Vonda's writing is really good. I'm really eager to read some of her other stuff. I know she's written a lot of science fiction, and this was really, in my mind, nowhere near a science fiction book. I've read plenty of fantasy and other books where it didn't bother me, but it definitely didn't read like a science fiction book. Her writing, her research was really good. It had some times where it got a little flowery or a little purple, I guess you could say, but only in a couple circumstances, and it just kind of was there to accentuate a scene, and it wasn't just thrown out everywhere. So the writing was just really good. The story and some of the issues that were brought up and brought to life in this book were good. And the ending was pretty good. It left me wanting something more until I thought about it a little bit more. I'll get to that in the spoiler at the end, but it was fairly satisfying at the end. Now, some of the cons, the middle part of this book stretched out quite a bit. It's not me to determine if it should have been shorter, but I found myself kind of just struggling through kind of the midsection of the book. The names were really difficult. Luckily, in the front of the book, there's kind of a major character section. And what's interesting is she puts an asterisk next to the people who are historical characters. So you can see right away which characters are the true historical characters and which ones are fictional. But I found myself flipping to the front of this book all the time trying to figure out who was who, because some of them are just called Madame. And you have to know that that's the Duchess of Dorleans, and there's other people who are called Madame at times, but there's this one character who is the Madame, So I found myself getting confused a lot and going back and trying to figure out who was who. And other than that, just, it's not exactly my wheelhouse of what I want to read, but I'm not going to fault anybody for that. I mean, I knew what I was getting into. Who might want to read this? Definitely fans of historical fiction and fantasy. I think if you're into that, the writing is really good. The historical accuracy, from what I can tell, is pretty interesting, and the fantasy aspects with these sea creatures was integrated pretty well. Overall, this is a hard one to rate. I think it's probably going to be a 3 for me. Probably pretty close to a 4, but not quite. It was just a bit long, a bit of a slog to get through the middle. Otherwise, it was very enjoyable read. And, I'd recommend it to fans of those genres, but maybe not a science. If you're a true hard science fiction fan, I probably wouldn't really recommend this to you. So the next book I'm going to read is also a book in the Masterpieces of Science Fiction series I'm doing. It's Frederick Pohl, Man Plus. I just started this. I'm into it a little bit. It's not a very long book, so it shouldn't take me very long to finish that and get a review out for that. So now in this part of the video, I'm going to talk about some reasons why this is kind of considered science fiction, and it'll definitely spoil some of the aspects of the book. So in the end, there's a lot of things that happen with the plot, and I won't spoil everything, so you could probably still read this book and not be spoiled completely on the plot. But our sea creature, she does end up living at the end, and she gets to go back out into the sea and reunite with her people. The king, after all this is done, he has these 3 fictional characters. The main character, Marie Joseph, her brother, Yves, who's the one who captured the sea creatures. And then the count, who is this dwarf in this book, who is basically the one who's closest to the king without being a blood relative to him. He listens to this guy, the count. He takes his counsel a lot. But they all kind of had to go against the king's wishes through the story, and the king is very unhappy with them, so he basically banishes them all. Now what happens is, when the sea creature gets back to her people, they realize how it was that they were caught. And they would have this ceremony on the summer solstice. They would have this ritual, and they would surface and have this kind of mating ritual. And that's how her brother stumbled across this idea, and he went to this place at a certain time. They all appeared, and he captured some of them. So they realized at that point that they needed to go into deeper hiding. They needed to avoid humans at all costs. And so they kind of disappeared. The other thing is, the king decided, after all this was done, he was so powerful, he had access to so much information, that he tasked, almost as punishment, that Yves, the main character's brother, his life goal at this point was to go through all of these books and all of these accounts, anywhere where there was talk of these sea creatures, these mermaids, sea people, whatever you want to call them, and remove it or alter it from the history. And so in the end, this is an alternate history where these sea creatures were real. These mermaids, these mermen were real. And because of these events, the king, and what the king did and what the sea creature did, basically put them into a mythical state. So before this, they were real, and the world was different. And because of these events, it brought our world to where we are now, where we just think of these sea creatures as mythical. So it was an interesting spin. I've read a lot of alternate history where you go back and history was all going along just normal, and then the events that happened changed history. So the future that ended up happening is different from where we are today. This was a little bit different, where you took a different history from the one we know, and these intersected, and this book and this story brought them together to our history. So it was kind of interesting. Once that kind of clicked in my head, I realized, okay, I kind of get the aspect of how this is a what if and a speculative story and a alternate history done in a different way. Because the whole time I'm reading it, I'm thinking, how is this even an alternate history? So at the end, you kind of get that reveal, you get that it all comes together and it makes a lot more sense. So hopefully you got some enjoyment out of that video if you watched here to the end. Kind of an interesting book. Still don't know if it's for everyone, but I did get quite a bit of enjoyment out of it. So we'll see you in the next video.